1853, on the Isle of Man, a working-class daughter of radical activists met an errand boy from Manchester who, as it happened, also had maternal links to anti-capitalist activism. They fell in love, got married, and moved to Manchester, where they had 11 children. He eventually rose to become the owner of a small business, while she became a teacher and focused on raising her children to be politically engaged, well-educated, and radical activists. Her primary focus was women's suffrage and rights, and so in 1872, on one cold and windy day, I assume it was cold and windy because Manchester, she took her 14-year-old daughter Emmeline to a meeting on women's suffrage. That daughter would become Emmeline Pankhurst, one of the most famous names in the history of women's liberation, as the founder of the WSPU, aka the Suffragettes. Emmeline would go on to lead a revolutionary movement for women's suffrage which would engage in tactics previously unheard of in polite society. But I don't really want to talk about Emmeline or her mother, Sylvia. This Lindsay Ellis-style intro is about Emmeline's second daughter, Sylvia. While being less militant than her mother and sister Christabel, Sylvia was in fact the one to convince her mother to set up the Women's Social and Political Union. She made posters, leaflets and banners, and even designed their first logo. A talented artist, she travelled around industrial towns in the UK, painting portraits and scenes of working class women at their labour. While her mother and sister focused their attention on middle and upper class women and polite society, Sylvia understood that it was working class women who not only most needed their help, but who possessed the power needed to make lasting socio-political change. The suffragette movement was, unsurprisingly, a movement for women's suffrage. But Sylvia knew that women needed so much more than the vote. They needed liberation. Liberation from the oppression of capitalism, of working themselves to death under terrible conditions, of dying of preventable complications of pregnancy and labour due to there being no resources or care available to them. She knew that solidarity among all women was necessary, and that the structures of capitalism and British imperialism were antithetical to that goal. As a pacifist, Sylvia was less militant than some of the other suffragettes, but she was by no means less passionate or radical. She worked tirelessly, publishing articles in newspapers, spreading the word among working class women. She was arrested more times than any other suffragette and braved torture in the form of forced feeding after her multiple hunger strikes. She staunchly believed that not only should the suffragette movement oppose imperialism, fascism, and capitalism, and include all women in their movement, but that they should also be fighting for decent healthcare, childcare, and education. When World War I began, her mother and sister threw their weight behind supporting recruitment drives for the army. Emmeline Pankhurst was a proud imperialist who saw the British Empire as a global force for good, and so naturally fully supported the British war effort. Sylvia could not support a pro-war position, and so instead, she returned to the working class areas of London and set up at-cost restaurants so people could afford food. She organised milk distribution centres for babies and mother and baby clinics. She lobbied for fairer pay for the working women, now having to also fill the roles of the men who had been sent to die. She opened a toy factory to give work to those suddenly without, which paid its female workers the same as the men's minimum wage of the time. And she organised for legal advice to be made available to the wives of fallen soldiers. While her own family were pushing for conscription and waving the Union Jack on high, Sylvia was on the ground, doing the things that the victims of war needed most. And this was unforgivable to many suffragettes who began publishing hit pieces about her, ostracising her from the movement she helped build. They went out of their way to attack her as a threat to the movement. However, the final straw for the tenuous solidarity between the suffragettes came when Sylvia gave birth to a son, and yet refused to marry the father, anarchist Silvio Carrillo. While they were in a relationship and living together, Sylvia always said that she would never marry him, as she would never take a man's name. This deviation from the traditional role of wife and mother was too much for her supposedly revolutionary mother to bear, and she disowned Sylvia, vowing never to speak to her again. But Sylvia continued with her anti-imperialist, anti-fascist activism, and when Mussolini's Italy invaded Ethiopia, Sylvia took the plight of Ethiopia to heart and began publishing literature in support of Ethiopian independence. Her work caught the attention of Haile Selassie, who invited her as his guest several times. Over the years, Sylvia became a friend and unofficial advisor to the Emperor of Ethiopia, and, after the tragic death of his daughter in childbirth, Sylvia raised the funds to open Ethiopia's first teaching hospital, which had been a dream of the Princess Tsahai. Later, Sylvia fought to open a specialist women's hospital and continued to work to improve the conditions of Ethiopian women and children. When her life partner Sylvia passed away, she and her son Richard moved to Ethiopia permanently, at the request of Haile Selassie. During the final years of her life, she produced publications about Ethiopian art, culture and society, and she lobbied for the return of Ethiopian artifacts and artworks, which had been stolen and spread out among Europe's museums. When Sylvia died at the age of 78, Haile Selassie declared her to be an honorary Ethiopian, and she received a state funeral and a burial spot among Ethiopia's most famous revolutionary heroes. Back in her home country, however, Sylvia and all the work she had done had already been largely forgotten. Till this day, she is memorialised more in Ethiopia than the UK, with only a blue plaque marking her residence in London, an ageing memorial society, and a failing crowdfunder for a statue remaining. For daring to challenge the confines of womanhood, defying the patriarchal hegemony to which so many supposed feminists still clung, for daring to speak out against the authority of a patriarchal state to impose imperialistic oppressions against millions of women worldwide, for trying to prevent the slaughter of thousands of men, and then actually taking steps to care for the women left behind, for daring to include those women who did not make perfect poster girls for suffrage, who were not marketable to men and the unconvinced, for caring about their needs more than the feelings and opinions of polite British society and conservative politicians. The price for this was expulsion, disownment, and being forgotten. This was the treatment of Sylvia Pankhurst by the wider suffragette movement, and it serves as a tidy example for the internal issues facing women's liberation and feminist movements till this day. So, let's talk about feminism. Now, the history of women's liberation and rights isn't something I can meaningfully cover in one video, so please consider this to be the first of many on the subject. This one will be specifically focused on a new form of feminism, the gender critical movement, and why, despite what you might read in The Guardian, it's certainly not new, definitely not radical, and by no means is concerned with the protection of women. I'm going to be addressing some of their concerns, as well as exploring some of the flaws of white feminism which seem to keep leading us towards exclusion. There's a big bibliography thing linked in the description. I took inspiration from some wonderful creators and writers, so there's definitely going to be things you want to check out down there. So get yourselves comfortable, because this is the longest video I've ever done. Grab yourself a drink, click yourself a like, do yourself a subscribe, and consider paying a visit to www.patreon.com/ponderful or not, you know, whatever. It's fine by me, either way. You know, it's there. Are we sitting comfortably? Then let's learn some herstory. The exclusionary tactics of those British suffragettes to one of their very own for daring to step slightly beyond the confines of acceptable womanhood pales in comparison to the long and violent history of feminist movements excluding women who never fell within the confines of their understanding of womanhood. The idea of womanhood coming with a strictly defined set of characteristics is an idea which has been wielded by feminists and anti-feminists forever. The anti-suffragette women's groups in the UK, for example, regressive women's groups ain't new. They hated the militant tactics of the suffragettes, which they claimed attacked the very essence of English womanhood. White abolitionist women in the USA who rallied for the liberation of slaves would later exclude black women from even attending their meetings and rallies, let alone from their suffrage goals. Emmeline Pankhurst in the UK was a staunch imperialist who couldn't cope with her daughter including working class women in her feminism. Mainstream feminist movements in the UK and North America owed everything to the work and activism of slave and impoverished women. Yet, as soon as any momentum was gained, these women were, I want to say dismissed or cast aside, but that would assume that these feminists ever considered them to be real women at all. Many suffragist movements held debates about which kinds of women should be allowed the vote. Those who can't read, those who are unmarried with children out of wedlock, the poorest, immigrants, former slaves, they surely wouldn't do. And when attempts at inclusion were made, either by radicals within their group or from the women without, excuses, if they were made, if they bothered to excuse this at all, were based in marketability and expediency. We'll never win the right to vote if we let those women vote. The PR campaigns of the early suffragist movements were, on one hand, impressive, remarkable, very effective, proper girl boss stuff actually, and on the other, an early indication of the tendency of mainstream movements to capitulate to the terms of patriarchal capitalism. White, respectable, Christian, conservative, and of course, cis, straight, neurotypical, and able-bodied women were the ones who deserved the rights, so long as they didn't let those other ones sneak in while the door was open. After all, for many of these early feminists, rights meant the right to do what men do, which meant participate in the structures of capitalism and the state. And given that only certain kinds of men could participate, that naturally meant the same for women. Of course, for centuries, poor and slave women had been doing what men do. Back-breaking labour for bosses, owners, landlords and kings. The only parts of the world of men which was unavailable to them would continue to be so long after early feminist wins. You know, you'll often hear people say, women's rights are human rights. And I agree. Women are human. World's best feminist, I know. It's good to have rights, like the right to life, that's a great one. Absolutely one of my faves, top 5 for sure. But that's actually a universal human right, which is being universally threatened by climate change. And what a coincidence I should mention that, because did you know that this video is sponsored by Wren? In the decades following the two world wars, women's liberation stalled. Fashion became considerably more conservative. Politics and capitalism birthed an ideal of the family which placed the modern woman still in the kitchen, but now as a consumer of goods, all designed to achieve the perfect home and more time to gossip over the garden fence. Education rates for women declined. The Hays Code meant that art and media was heavily restricted on the grounds of enforcing Christian moral standards. And now I've read a bit of that Bible book them Christians like so much, and a feminist masterpiece it ain't. The conservatism of the 40s and 50s was to be shaken, of course, and with the rebellions of the civil rights and the anti-war movements and the free-loving hippie vibes of the 60s, came a new wave of women's liberation activists. Once again, with their roots firmly in the momentum gained by civil rights groups, as well as women's labour movements in both the USA and the UK, which of course were entirely made of the working poor and predominantly immigrant and women of colour. This new wave of feminism's main focus would be bodily autonomy and sexual liberation, including pushes for the legalisation of abortion, access to contraception, lesbian rights and liberation movements, demand for sexual equality and educational and professional treatment and outcomes, and an international anti-rape movement. Anti-rape movements have their roots way earlier, with several laws being passed at various times and places, attempting to, make it a crime. But to skip a century or so, the modern anti-rape movement started with victim speak-outs, in which victims would speak out. Basic stuff, you might think, but that, just in itself, oppressed people speaking, talking to each other about what had happened to them. That was revolutionary, and a revolution it sparked. More laws were passed. Women's groups did marches and rallies and protests, calling for their experiences to be taken seriously, and victims began setting up crisis centres, helplines, and shelters. When women had few rights and resources beyond their husbands, and when husbands had rights and power over their wives, providing women and children a space where they could escape their husbands and fathers was a lifesaver to anyone who needed it. One of my other gender critical based videos is going to be about IPV provisions and safe spaces and female only spaces, because I have a lot to say about that which reaches beyond the scope of feminism, so you'll have to wait. Drives aimed at educating the public, law enforcement and officials about the realities and complexities of this kind of violence, how to respond to victims, how to process evidence, and to undermine the culture of acceptance and victim blaming, which, till this day, is pervasive in, well, everywhere I've been. But all in all, for the first time ever, sexual and domestic violence against women and children was taken as a serious crime and societal problem. For the first time ever. As well as this, a cultural shift was desired. Bodily autonomy and sexual liberation required women to have lives for themselves, independent of male figures or children. The concept of the woman as eternal devotee to the family, or viewed always as wife of, mother of, daughter of. This had to change. Not only did the opportunities available to women need to change, the behaviour of women and the language with which we used to talk about them did too. The use of the honorific Ms offered a way for women to identify themselves irrespective of their marital status, and there were even failed attempts to remove the word man from woman. Literally trying to erase the word woman. With the publication of The Feminine Mystique in 1963, which was an analysis and critique of suburban housewife life and its effect on the mental health of American women, most mainstream feminist movements rejected the housewife lifestyle as antithetical to women's liberation. Interestingly, in Women, Race and Class, Angela Davis draws attention to the fact that the role of the woman within the Black enslaved family was not one that was seen as lesser. And this fact was seen as a threat by those who wished to uphold patriarchal structures. And it's been used as a stick with which to beat Black families ever since. But as Davis writes,
the sexual division of domestic labor within enslaved families does not appear to have been hierarchical. Moreover, from all indications, the division of labor between the sexes was not always so rigorous, for men would sometimes work in the cabin and women might tend the garden and perhaps even join the hunt. The labor that slaves performed for their own sake and not for the aggrandizement of their masters was carried out on terms of equality. Within the confines of their family and community life, therefore, Black people managed to accomplish a magnificent feat.
So again, we see that marginalised women and their families were already challenging, already forced to live outside the structures and ideals that white feminists would later seek to upend. And so, even the upending of these ideals would still fail to serve these women, whose needs differed from the ones of white, middle-class feminists. Another exclusionary flip side to the rejection of housewifey ideals was the women who just wanted to do that. Women who wanted to take care of their household and family. These women were at best dismissed or ignored, but at worst called traitors or handmaidens of the patriarchy. And this exists till this day. You can see that in the hashtag boss bitch feminism that we see every bloody where. Like, of course it's fine to have kids, so long as you are rising and grinding, side hustling your Insta feed, and have a usually male partner who doesn't mind changing the occasional nappy. Women who want to dedicate their time and labour to caring for their family, creating comfort and security in a chaotic world, the priceless, invaluable labour of raising healthy, happy children. These women have few feminist comrades and way too often end up having to turn to the conservative right for acceptance and validation. While aiming to end or at least reduce the objectification of women, beauty standards were also challenged. Women stopped shaving, cut their hair short, adopted fashions that prioritised comfort and freedom. During the 60s and 70s, fashions and beauty standards did shift away from the hyper-feminine hourglass symbols of the 40s and 50s. But again, not so far away as to include black, fat, disabled or elderly bodies. And of course, with this critique of beauty standards and the objectification of women, also came exclusion of women who simply liked makeup, lingerie and gowns. Those women who just liked that stuff were seen as conforming to stereotypes and, of course, betraying the feminist movement. There's also a lot to be said, in fact too much to be said, about sex worker inclusion within feminism. Well, there's more to be said about sex worker exclusion from feminism. And for me, that's a topic that really deserves a full video and my full attention and focus. But while I'm just talking away about exclusion from feminist movements, I cannot not mention this. The rejection of the girly girl as somehow capitulating to patriarchy it's starting to change, but it's like recently starting to change. I mean, when I was growing up, like, not like other girls, culture was just normal. Good to be an N-log, actually. Like, seriously, there was articles in my teenage girl magazines on, like, how to be a cool girl. And I was. Thankfully, this is starting to change. But again, the hyper-feminine figure who loves pink, big hair, big boobs, sexy lingerie, but who owns her sexuality and whose femininity is for nobody but herself. This wouldn't be possible without trails being blazed by Black women and artists. Excluding any kind of women from our feminism, even white, middle class, older cis women, because we don't believe their choices are radical enough. Any kind of exclusionary or divisive mentality will always be antithetical to collective liberation and will leave room wide open for the conservative and far right. Part 2. Gender critical. Gender critical is the term used to describe an ideology and the people who hold it who are against gender ideology. And what is that? So we usually talk about sex and gender is commonly understood to be about socially constructed characteristics such as norms, roles, appearances, and relations between different groups of people of different gender. How gender is understood varies from society to society, and it can and does change over time. Historically, different cultures and societies have had vastly different outlooks towards gender identity and expression, as well as how many genders there are, and even on the importance of quantifying one's gender over time. Gender is sometimes thought of, especially in gender-critical circles, as being opposed to biological sex. I mean, I would say that we just have different ways of talking about different parts of human identity. But for some people out there, like Boba apparently, that simply will not do. Oh, for those people, gender ideology is a phrase they use to describe anyone or thing which in their minds seeks to remove biological sex from its rightful position as the most important thing. Anti-gender movements have unfortunately been a thing for a few decades now. What was originally a Catholic-led anti-abortion movement has morphed into way more than just that. These days, the anti-gender movement is closely focused on trans rights and has moved far beyond the realms of religious organisations. Although, as we will later see, ties to its roots remain strong. Modern self-declared gender-critical people include most of the far alt religious and conservative right, as well as public figures such as J.K. Rowling, TV writer Graham Linehan, MP Rosie Duffield, Olympian Sharon Davies, and I think on last count about 89% of Guardian columnists. That was a joke. I don't know the accurate figure. It could be as low as 87%. These are people who are quite outspoken in their gender critical views, but there are way more public figures, politicians, journalists who hold what I would call gender critical sympathetic views. Just as a side note, I think I'm going to start saying GC instead of gender critical or gender criticalism, because I stumble over my words enough filming these. See, I'm stumbling over my words now. I stumble over my words a lot. I need to make it easy on myself. So what does Sharon Davies, anti-abortion Catholics, outright fascists and the suffragettes have in common? Well, the reason that GC has its roots firmly in Catholic anti-abortion movements is fairly simple. It's biological essentialism, and it's bad. Biological essentialism is understood as
the belief that human nature, an individual's personality, or some specific quality, such as intelligence, creativity, homosexuality, masculinity, femininity, or a male propensity to aggression, is an innate and natural essence, rather than a product of circumstances, upbringing, and culture. The concept is typically invoked where there is a focus on difference, as where females are seen as essentially different from males.
Now, as I've already said, I've read a bit of that Bible thing the Christians are fond of. And right sort of in the first part, you might remember a lot of emphasis being placed on the differing roles and rules of men and women. The main vibe being women are property of their fathers, then husbands, and are expected to make babies and nothing else. Rules placed on women were designed to restrict her sexuality and baby-making capabilities to the man who was responsible for her, and to confine her within this realm. Now, I'm not here to get into which religion is the most misogynistic thing, or even to attack the Bible, but till this day, religious fundamentalist organisations have sought to restrict women to that which they believe is the purpose of women: to bear and raise children and offer support and sex to her husband. And as we have recently seen in the USA, this is an ongoing and successful mission. And biological essentialism is used to achieve this. It holds that it's simply in our nature to have kids and do mum stuff. When applied to sex, biological essentialism holds that men and women, due to their biology, have essential, intrinsic, and changeable differences and characteristics. For example, that male propensity for violence. Boys will be boys' attitudes when it comes to sexual assault, as well as a view of women as non-violent, non-abusive, and naturally caring and maternal. As you can see, biological essentialism harms men and women alike. Never mind those who don't identify as either. And it has been used for centuries to enforce segregation of the sexes in both public and private spaces. In fact, the idea of human nature as something intrinsic to all humans and from which we should not deviate. This is something that has supported all kinds of oppression on the grounds of degeneracy. So to religious fundamentalists, the idea that gender might be more important than biological sex attacks their fundamental belief that society should be concerned with restricting the reproductive rights of women based on our God-given nature. If gender has nothing to do with reproduction and can be fluid to any degree, then that invalidates the God-given role of men. So you can see why religious organisations might be incentivised to spend ridiculous amounts of money and time dismissing the idea of gender ideology as nonsense or stronger, dangerous. But what about these gender criticals if they're going around calling themselves feminists? Why do they agree with such a thing? Despite the fact that gender critical has its roots placed firmly in biological essentialism, which has its roots placed firmly in the idea of intelligent design, you wouldn't expect your average gender critical person to know that or understand what it is. If you went up to a gender critical activist and asked what it is they're standing for, they won't say biological essentialism. They will say women's rights. Quick little disclaimer before we move on. This video is kind of for the uninitiated, right? It's not one for the choir. If you're already well versed in all of this, it might seem a bit basic. And I want to re-clarify that this video is specifically concerned with how gender criticalism interacts with feminism and women's liberation in general. I am not trying to speak for trans people. This video doesn't even really speak to trans rights at all. Although you will find plenty of resources linked in the description from trans people about these basic concepts. So if you're curious and you want to learn more, really do consider checking out that document because there's just loads of links, loads of things to learn, all from really cool and entertaining creators. So in this video, I'm speaking from my perspective as a woman. The type of woman, as it happens, that gender critical people seem to be very concerned with. They have a lot to say about women like me, domestic abuse and sexual assault survivors, autistic women even, and they claim to be speaking on my behalf. So that's what this video is. Me speaking on my own behalf. And if you haven't noticed, I also happen to be a bit British. And if you're also a bit British, then chances are you're being fed a gender critical narrative all day, every day. And some of those gender criticals, at least to the unaware, can sometimes seem pretty reasonable.
All we're saying is biology matters.
If trans people were under attack, I would march with them, but they're not.
Nothing about us without us.
We just don't want to see children irreversibly damaged.
Lesbians are going extinct.
Women's voices are being erased.
We don't want feminist progress to be undone.
We just want to protect women's rights.
You can't identify out of misogyny.
Women deserve security and safe spaces.
But women's rights are under attack.
Children need protecting from harmful ideologies.
Being a woman isn't just about wearing a dress.
A woman is not an idea in a man's head.
We're only saying sex is real.
Now, GCs make a lot of what they call arguments, and I couldn't possibly address them all in one video. I will be addressing them in other videos though. In this video, I want to focus on the claim that gender critical people are standing for women's liberation. As I said before, I'm going to be doing a whole video on spaces, female only spaces, safe spaces, spacey thing. So I'll be talking about what they say about that in that. So, spaces aside, what are these gender criticals actually saying? Language seems to be one of the biggest bees in their bonnet. Now, I won't get into the whole chest feeding, birthing parent, cervix possessor thing here, because honestly I find that particular side of the moral panic particularly silly, especially when those most angry about it are using terms like penist individual. But mainly because language always changes. We're always looking for ways to be more inclusive, and sometimes that looks a bit clumsy. But all those new and inclusive phrases being tried out are for use in such specific circumstances. Like, it's literally just mainly for the medical profession. A profession where clarity, specificity, and inclusivity are of the utmost importance. Not all mothers give birth. Not all women who have given birth want to be called mothers. And yes, there are trans men and non-binary people who might give birth. So birthing parent or child bearer or whatever is just a more accurate way of describing the serious medical condition of being pregnant and giving birth. Far more accurate than mother or woman, neither of which are medical conditions. But honestly, this is my brain every single time I see a GC pearl clutcher claim that we can't say woman anymore. It literally is just that, unironically. But language is important. Having words with which we can express ourselves is inherently liberating. As part of their amazing series, Inside a Cult, Caelen Conrad powerfully and beautifully describes one of their darker moments. After suffering a violent assault at the hands of bigoted strangers and living with the anxiety they were left with, they temporarily sought comfort in anger. And I'll just let them tell you what happened next.
The other main tactic to recruit LGBT people is to manipulate them into believing there is an epidemic of straight people co-opting the slur queer, and that gender-critical activists are fighting against this. These posts would be screenshots of people saying things like, "As a polysexual, I have the right to call myself queer. What's a polysexual? I'd ask in the comments. They'd all have mostly different answers, things like straight people who aren't even gay enough to be bi, or straight people who want to seem cool. Of course, had I calmly thought to myself for a moment, I'd probably have come to a different conclusion. But I wasn't calm. I felt like my heart had been racing for months. My skin was on fire. How dare they? How dare you take that word from me? I was a queer. I knew what being queer was. It was discrimination. It was pain. It was living in a world where just walking alone at night meant that I was fair game. I had no idea what this polysexual person had been through, but I was still absolutely certain it wasn't enough on its own in my books to reclaim the slur. And listen, I didn't care for nearly anyone in these groups, as I realized most of them were simply there to have a place to vent their hatred towards marginalized people. I downvoted those posts and occasionally got in arguments, but I wasn't there to engage. I was there because that burning rage, that terrible pain needed a focus. And it gave me a sense of validation because every screenshot of a tweet saying cis gays aren't oppressed was another tweet that affirmed what I was hearing in these subreddits, that they were trying to make the word queer meaningless. And if I believe this conspiracy theory to be true, then my anger suddenly becomes righteous. I'm on the side of protecting the LGBs. The cognitive dissonance I developed to allow me this outlet for my anger was unsustainable for someone as in their head as I am. I don't pal around with homophobes and misogynists, and the fact that I had even been sharing my anger with them was sign enough that I was on the wrong path. And while this entire period probably didn't last more than 90 days, it has allowed me a degree of insight into how trauma, pain, and a marginalized identity can be used to distract from obvious indoctrination tactics. How easy it is to be manipulated when the ideology being pushed aligns with your gut feelings on the world, confirming your fears and your biases, telling you that you were right all along. And who doesn't like being right? And so because of this experience, I can kind of understand and empathize with gender-critical women, especially for the recruits whose only education about trans women comes from gender-critical misinformation and propaganda. I get the feeling behind...
How dare you? How dare you take that word from me? I am a woman. I know what being a woman is.
Queer was. It was discrimination. It was pain.
It was pain. It was living in a world where just walking alone at night meant I was fair game. I had no idea what this transgender woman had been through, but I was absolutely certain it wasn't enough in my books to claim the term woman.
Of course, had either of us cared enough to ask, we might have found a lot more in common than we had expected. We might have found quite a lot of shared pain, and maybe we would have thought about the fact that as long as we define who we are through our oppression, then we can only exist as long as we're oppressed.
When you base your sense of identity, your sense of what it is to be a woman, on the very specific confines of your own womanhood, then it might be hard for you to see other people who haven't shared that experience using the words and language that you need to talk about yourself. But when we try to decide upon which and how many aspects of womanhood are enough to maketh the woman, in order to show why we shouldn't let trans women use the word woman, we inevitably and always fall into excluding whole groups of cis women from our definition, just as white feminism has always done. My experience of being a woman, of periods, of sex, of femininity, of boobs and beauty, of healthcare, of objectification, of misogyny, violence and pain, this will be nothing like the experience of the unhoused woman living under the bridge downtown, or the woman in modern-day slavery building fast construction projects for huge corporations, or the woman who was born with different reproductive organs or genitalia, or the disabled woman living in full-time care, or the rich celebrity woman in her Beverly Hills mansion, or the elderly housebound woman who has become invisible to society, or the trans woman holding her pee until she gets home, risking infection because she's afraid to use public bathrooms. There is no universal experience of womanhood, and there never has been. This is one of the points that the theory of intersectionality is trying to get across. 1,000,001 things shape impact, and inform individuals over the course of a lifetime. And this might be a good place to counter another popular GC claim. You see, even when a trans woman does pass as cis, when she does all the things that the gender gatekeepers put in front of her, she will still never be accepted by gender criticals because of her male upbringing. Everyone's formative years shapes them fundamentally. There's no escaping that. But to suggest that trans kids of any gender have the same experience as cis kids is utter madness. Most or all trans and queer people I know have been bullied and ostracized for their whole lives on the basis of their queerness or transness. It is absolutely wild to me that anyone can suggest that the people who have very obviously been the target of toxic masculinity have somehow benefited from patriarchy. How is that not victim blaming? Most feminists, there is no universal experience of womanhood or girlhood or manhood or boyhood or transness or queerness, and that's okay. Because to say that there is no universal experience of womanhood, that doesn't negate the need for women's rights. It doesn't negate the need for sex to be held as a protected characteristic for the means of preventing discrimination. And to suggest it did would be silly sauce. You don't need universal experiences to have solidarity, and to suggest as much would render all solidarity between differing groups impossible. It doesn't matter that trans women are different to me. I'm different to millions of women. The variety of human beings is what makes us so beautiful, so creative, so impactful. But you know, this trying to identify what makes a real woman, it's done things to the gender critical brain. We can always tell is a bit of a meme online now. What started with like some GC types like bragging about how you can always tell a trans woman has led to just like multitudes of photos of beautiful cis women being called men by gender critical people. One even said a photo of J.K. Rowling, her very self, was a man, so lols all round. All you have to do is plant a seed of doubt that a woman might be trans, and gender criticals will fall over themselves to pinpoint every single tiny detail that they think is too masculine or an obvious tell. And this is funny enough when people do it to supermodels or famous actresses or J.K. Rowling. It's amusing to watch the cognitive dissonance on display in real time. But let's not pretend they're not also doing this to just every person they meet in real life. A movement of mainly women getting it into their heads that there is a global agenda which is trying to erase cis women and replace them with trans women, that there are simply hundreds, if not thousands of men out there pretending to be women in order to sneak into our spaces. And gender criticals do think this, by the way. This is a breeding ground for a pervasive paranoia which has them judging mainly women on their appearance, solely based on how feminine and soft they look. I'll talk more about this on my video on spaces, but the bathroom problem is an issue that cis butch women have been talking about for a long time. Butch cis women have long found it difficult to access public bathrooms due to being misgendered, essentially called men and accused of trespassing in the women's loos. Cis women being targeted and harassed for not looking feminine enough. So much feminism, I can't even cope with it. In part 3 of Caelen's series, they talk about the various kinds of bigotry on display in gender critical groups, including, but certainly not limited to, misogyny. Caelen spent months undercover in gender critical Facebook groups, collecting data, screenshots, and evidence of this. I do urge you to watch their series if you can, but what was on display regarding misogyny, I honestly found to be rather sad.
When it's necessary to insult trans women, they immediately go to gendered stereotypes. In this instance, someone took a screenshot of a company Instagram photo, and a woman in the photo was trans. They immediately began commenting on her outfit and appearance, comments like,
A real woman would have coordinated her outfit with the others.
They're dressed casually, but in a normal way. The Tim is dressed like a straight-up child. Grown women just don't wear things like that, especially if they're getting their picture taken. Just one of the many ways that these dudes have no clue what it actually is like to be a woman.
regardless of the fact that other people in the group said that that wasn't true for them. They were like,
I wear that, I'm 36.
The fact is that any movement that tries to exclude trans people through policing visible gender nonconformity will always, by necessity, also limit the freedom of expression of women. Even tall women are not women enough at first glance for some of these people anymore.
Help! Whenever I see a tall woman now, I question whether he is a man or not. Anyone else?
Restrictive gender norms that feminists fought so long to abolish are even celebrated among gender-critical parents, forcing their daughters to shave their legs or their armpits or cover them up.
Shave pits or cover pits? She can pick.
Even going as far as to pay their children to adhere to patriarchal ideas of womanhood.
I bribed my female-to-male kid $20 a month to shave her legs. I'm happy to pay it.
I mean, if your ideology has you afraid of tall women, I'd be giving it a rest with the old Facebook groups if I were you. Tall women rock. What we see when we look into gender-critical spaces is women being forced to conform to gender norms, or risk being judged, mocked, bullied, or having their achievements undermined. Take that Chinese athletics team who did really well, won some medals at the sporting fields. I don't know, I don't sport. But anyway, instead of getting to celebrate and just be happy in their accomplishment, they and the athletics organisation that they were associated with were forced to spend their days defending their womanhood to a bunch of angry gender criticals who had gotten a hold of a photo of them and made it go viral as being a women's team full of men. All the women on that team are cis. But they did have strong jawlines though, so I guess it's fair game. And as the prominent theme of Caelen's series makes clear, the harm done to trans kids by parents in these gender critical groups is incalculable. Like, the series is a bit of a hard watch just due to the heartbreaking stories of child abuse at the hands of these supposedly concerned parents. Bribing them to remove body hair is the least of it. And gender critical activists have some choice words for cis women who do not agree with them. Handmaid or handmaiden being the overwhelming favourite. When accused of bigotry, when it's pointed out to them that human rights are good, actually, and usually only bigots want to remove minority groups of their rights, GCs will respond by saying that, while that is normally the case, doesn't apply to them, you see, because, they say, trans rights conflict with women's rights. Now, a lot of their reasoning for this is concerned with female-only spaces, so you will have to wait for my other video for my thoughts on that. It's also in that video that I'll address the fake trans argument, so watch out for that. But the idea that the liberation of trans people poses a threat to women and children, this idea is giving me deja vu. Mainly because protecting women and children has always been the main rallying cry for all bigotry ever. White suffragettes thought that civil rights for black people were a threat to women's rights. Because if black people got the vote, then black men would have power over white women. Not to mention the long history of racist propaganda solely focused on painting black men as a threat to white women. For a long time, bisexual men were painted as a threat to women. Gay marriage was a threat to the family. It erased the meaning of marriage. And of course, gay men have long been propagandized as threats to children. Modern anti-immigration and anti-refugee bigots use women and children's rights to excuse their bigotry. I've lost count of the number of times some anti-immigration, flag-shagging Islamophobe told me that I must be fine with women and children being raped. These days, however, I mainly hear that from gender criticals. Lots. Of course, I can't simply point to other forms of bigotry and go, you sound like them. That never convinced anyone. Also, me pointing to the history of white feminism and the tendency of excluding women who didn't fall within the confines of what was considered to be a real woman, that won't convince a gender critical either, who will simply pronounce that trans women aren't women. I might say, yes they are, or of course they are. I might look to definitions and thought experiments that prove that they are, but they'll just call that a difference of opinion. I might retort by saying that white suffragettes didn't consider black women or disabled women to be fully human, let alone real women. But again, historical comparisons don't usually do much to convince people. So let's see what GCs are actually saying today. The sexist dichotomy of the gender criticals. When GCs talk about the dangers of allowing trans women in the loos, or talk about the irreversible damage done to confused and misled girls, I say when they talk about that. When aren't they talking about that? But when they do, they display the very sexist, very biological essentialist, dichotomous worldview that they entertain. When GCs talk about trans men being the confused victims of brainwashing, who only need some acceptance or to learn to feel beautiful in their own skin or to have their breasts caressed, seriously, that this is all they need to see the error of their ways. It's because they think that trans men are women, and women are feeble-minded and easily led. Or maybe they just need to remember that being butch is an option. Maybe they just forgot about it with the little lady brains. When GCs say that trans women pose a threat to women, it's because they believe that they are men and that men pose a threat to women. Oh, you can just feel the statistics being angrily typed into the comment section, can't you? So alright, let's talk about men. It is true that violence against women, all women, is usually perpetrated by men. The same goes for most violence against men. Most violence in general, it seems, tends to be done by the cis men's. And so what should we make of such facts? Such undeniable statistical certainty? Might we look to see how patriarchal ideas and structures and toxic masculinity has nurtured young men into acting a certain way? How material conditions, again due to capitalism and patriarchal ideas, have historically affected men in different ways to women? Should we analyse how the systemic objectification of women's bodies, the dehumanisation of women and girls can lead to men feeling certain ways about us? How the cycle of generational abuse is almost always present in instances of violence? How socioeconomics, culture, media, upbringing has led to a situation in which men feel under pressure yet disempowered and women are seen as objects, receptacles, receivers? There is a long history behind how we as humanity went from largely matriarchal, communal caring cultures to the atomized and pressurized systems of today, in which the nuclear family is seen as common sense and gender roles are defined along this highly illogical basis. Might the answer to the statistical likelihood of men acting violently lie somewhere in there? Or should we assume that there's just something inside all people who are born with a penis that drives them towards violence? An essence of some kind. That's what makes this all so much worse, is they're not even creative with their biological essentialism. Like, it is bog standard. Men are strong, predatory, prone to violence, sex-obsessed, and always looking to subjugate women. And women are eternal victims, powerless, weak, maternal, and non-violent. It's the boys will be boys excuse for sexual violence, but with extra steps. Those are kind of abstract ideological ways in which gender criticalism is antithetical to feminism, and honestly, if their shit stayed in the abstract, I probably wouldn't be making this way too long video about it. But the stink of gender-critical ideology can be smelled in ever-increasing areas of public life and policy. Remember I said that the roots to the anti-abortion Christian conservative right remain strong? Well, the European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights, the EUPF, produced a report into the financial funding of extremist groups and politics from outside of the EU. And one thing that stands out to me, besides all the hundreds of millions of dollars pouring in from Christian conservative groups, is that the EU doesn't distinguish between anti-trans rights groups and anti-abortion groups. Rather, it calls them all anti-gender, for reasons I outlined earlier. GCs will obfuscate about the financing issue with some of them just announcing that they're happy to work with and be supported by the far right actually. It's fine. While others usually plead ignorance. In fact, just this week, prominent gender-critical activists have been promoting a new film documentary thing called What is a Woman, which is made by a self-declared anti-feminist. I think he said that feminism is a cancer, full-on anti-abortion, anti-gay marriage, bog-standard bigot dude. It's fine for the gender criticals. It's all good. I think Katy Montgomerie described it best. As she wrote on Twitter, one of the many reasons I don't believe GCs when they say that it's just a coincidence they're allying with anti-abortionists against trans rights is that they won't ally with trans feminists over abortion. Speaking of Katy, in this interview, Katy and Joe Mom of the Good Law Project discussed that far-right funding I was telling you about.
They're very media savvy. They seem to have enormous amounts of money. We know that vast amounts of money are coming into the UK from the Christian right. We don't know where that money is going, but it must be going somewhere. And if it isn't going in part to many of these crowdfunders and many of these organisations that seem to spring up out of nowhere with very professional offers, I'd be pretty amazed. I had this discussion actually with the LGBA founder, and she said, well, no, all of our money comes from members of the public. And I said, well, how do you know? Because you don't know who is giving you money. Even if money comes into your crowdfunder, people have the option of telling you who they are.
It's self-ID, isn't it?
It's self-ID, that's right. And so you just have no way of knowing, in truth, whether the money is being fed in dribs and drabs from some huge Christian right organisation in the States, or from somebody who's genuinely concerned in the UK.
There was one ages ago, because some, as well as these big attacks on law, there's been lots of different defamation and stuff cases going on around this as well, and there's also been cases about police misconduct. There's been lots of different things, and I can't remember exactly what it was, and I'm not going to say who it was, but a gender critical person had some law trouble and they needed money for some case. But in that thing, they people were accusing them of taking money from the religious right and stuff, because that's the accusation that gender criticals always get. And she was kind of accidentally mask off, said, you know what, I did have a religious right organisation come and say that they'd pay all of my fees and we wouldn't have to, and I turned them down. So if anyone says we're being funded by the right, they're lying. And I was like, yeah, but they wouldn't have come to me and offered me the money, would they? They did offer you.
Well, so all the other people who, there'll be lots of people around who have had that same offer and who haven't said no.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly there is a huge avalanche of money from the Christian right coming into the UK and Europe. There's report after report after report that identifies that the number is in the billions of pounds. And, the trans community in the UK does not have much support in the establishment. As you rightly point out, it's very, very difficult to get any newspaper to give trans people any sort of a hearing, let alone a reasonable and sustained one.
The full interview is linked below, and I do urge you to go and watch it. Later on, they talk about how gender criticals are placing themselves in the centre of power, including the British Equality and Human Rights Commission. That's the public body overseeing all human rights in the UK. And the harm to feminist progress just does not stop. You know how feminism is often painted as man-hatred, and then feminists have to spend great amounts of time explaining basic concepts like equal? The framing of feminism as being anti-men is one of the most effective ways that patriarchal power has put people off feminism.
A 2018 YouGov poll found that 34% of women in the UK said yes when asked whether they were a feminist, up from 27% in 2013. However, people do not appear to reject the term feminism because they're against gender equality or believe it has been achieved. The same study found that 8 out of 10 people said men and women should be treated equally in every way, with many agreeing sexism is still an issue.
This apparent contradiction between only 34% of women in the UK calling themselves feminists, and yet 8 out of 10 British people saying that they basically agree with feminism, I think that can certainly be explained by the viewing of feminism as being anti-men. And men, anything masculine, anything at all penis related, is viewed with utter derision in GC circles. Unless, of course, the menfolk are being called in to protect us. If they're performing their traditional role as protector of women and children, then that's permissible. In fact, vehemently encouraged by gender criticals, including by inviting armed men into women's toilets.
I'm talking about you dads who maybe carry, I think that's what you say, I'm so down with the American lingo, maybe you carry, maybe you don't, maybe you consider yourself a protector of women, maybe you're that sort of man, maybe you have a daughter or a mother or a wife, maybe you have a sister, maybe you just have some friends, maybe you just think women are human and you don't need any absolute connection with them to feel compelled to protect us. I think you should start using women's toilets, men.
Literally armed men at the toilet doors, making sure you've got the right genitals for entry. Or of course, you know, they could just hang around in there with their guns, keeping an eye on things, you know, in case anything creepy happened. This is the future GCs want. Aligning with and accepting funding from far-right and Christian conservative groups and media institutions who are absolutely about policing women's bodies, claiming to speak for all women while dismissing any woman who doesn't agree by using overtly misogynistic tropes, judging the appearance of other women for being too tall, too hairy, too strong, not soft enough, not feminine enough, inviting cis men into female spaces for our protection, declaring that the universal experience of womanhood is about pain, victimhood and oppression, without any consideration as to how intersectionality interacts with oppression, holding the feelings of white, wealthy, able-bodied, neurotypical women as more important than the material harm being done to marginalised women by the politics they support. They support right-wing parties both with their votes and advocacy, infiltrating the upper levels of power to ensure that biological essentialism continues to influence policy, wrongly arguing that women could never match men in sport, encouraging men to be men, abusing their children who wish to explore their gender identity and sexuality, actively undermining public opinion of feminism by holding anything masculine in contempt. This is not an exhaustive list, but I do hope it shows why gender-critical feminism is actually just a continuation of the same conservative, Christian, right-wing nonsense that has always held women back. But then how do so many gender-critical women believe that they are still protecting women's rights? Part 1 of Caelen's series explains in detail how gender-critical activists recruit people, often parents, who are either concerned or confused. How they use tactics usually reserved for cults to twist women's concerns into fear, paranoia, and eventually hatred. And there's other reasons why women might turn to the supposed support that they think they're finding in these groups. Jealousy, for example. It's very common for straight people to feel jealousy over what they perceive to be a celebration of LGBTQ people. They see rainbow logos and pride displays in supermarkets and take from that LGBTQ people can't be oppressed. But this is just white lives matter levels of thinking. This is a man standing at a suffragette rally holding a sign saying votes for men. Maybe they feel overlooked. Maybe they feel repressed. Maybe, as some of them openly admit, they might have liked the freedom to explore their gender and sexuality when they were younger. It's kind of like that whole, I had to pay tuition fees, so it would be unfair to scrap them now kind of thing. But as Caelen points out, many simply concerned women come and go from these groups all the time. But the ones who stay, the ones on whom the constant cultish barrage of propaganda is effective, the ones who become vocal activists, who begin making content and lobbying politicians, they cannot be explained away by ignorance. And when what they are saying is so completely in line with what the far right are saying, so much so that the EU doesn't even bother to distinguish between them, we should take them at their word. When somebody shows you who they are, believe them. And I believe that the gender-critical movement is nothing more than a furthering of the same far-right, fascistic oppression of women that we have always seen. But as I hope to have shown, the very limited feminism of white, middle-class, cis women not only has a long and sordid history, but it will continue to restrict women's liberation so long as white, middle-class, able-bodied, neurotypical cis women are seen as the default. So long as they're the only women with any meaningful power in what is still very much a man's world. Outdated concepts of social hierarchy which shape our current societies are embedded in our minds, and people have a tendency to apply hierarchical thinking to all manner of things. You can't have equality and hierarchy. You can't have equality and capitalism, which is in itself a kind of hierarchy. Sylvia Pankhurst knew this. Feminists of colour always knew this. In fact, the only ones who don't know this, or at least who resist accepting this, are the ones who find themselves, or at least perceive themselves to be, close to the top of this hierarchy, and who do not wish to risk this position. This tendency for white feminists to believe that they should be the ones taking the charge, that they will fight for the rights that they believe we all need. This exposes the we know best mentality which has always been a feature of white polite society. It's seen in the way that straight people judge gay people for the way they express themselves. It's seen in all respectability politics. It's seen in the way that able-bodied and neurotypical people talk down to disabled and neurodivergent folk. Having a default type of person by which all other people should be compared is in itself a hierarchy. And it can be uncomfortable for those who are the default, those who believe themselves to be near the top of this hierarchy, to learn how to view themselves as just one of many, one voice among millions of equal voices. If you have an idea of women's liberation which is centered on women like you, with the needs you have, then attempts to include different kinds of women with different kinds of needs might well feel like being pushed aside. You might then feel like pushing back. It's understandable, but it's not forgivable. Centering arguably the most privileged women in the world will inevitably push out the most marginalised. And I am not only talking about trans women. The needs of marginalised women, I mean all marginalised women, have never been at the centre of mainstream feminist movements. And the gender critical movement, far from being radical, is just a continuation of this trend. Putting your own feelings of discomfort before the rights and freedoms of marginalised women, and in so doing, promoting politics, ideologies and mindsets, laws and policies which inevitably harm all women. These are not the acts of a feminist. These are the act of a bigot who uses feminism as their smokescreen. You do not get to claim to speak for women. You do not speak for me. And I will not let your claims of feminism go unchallenged. Oh, bloody hell, okay, that was long, wasn't it? Okay, don't forget to check out the sources in the description. There's lots of cool stuff down there. And if you'd like to see more videos about women's liberation, then subscribe and ding dong that bell. Current topic ideas include feminism and capitalism, gender criticalism and ableism, of course the one about female-only spaces and sex workers, and something in which I want to merge Sean's analysis of the Harry Potter universe with how white feminism operates. It's niche, but I think it works. Congratulations to Wren for getting to be my first ever sponsor. Thank you to the lovely people who lended their voice for this one. You'll find all of their social medias and channels and things linked in the description as well. Go follow them, they're all amazing. And of course, many, many thanks to my patrons who made all of this possible. Whew. 8 hours. 8 hours it took me to film this.